Hi, my name is Steven and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about Extreme Cheapskates Part 2, the pros and cons of money saving strategies. As part of the series, I go over the pros and cons of money saving strategies and help you determine whether or not it's a good fit for you. Not only do I detail the money saving strategies that I go through, but I also show you what are some of the pros and cons behind them. And some of the cons of these money saving strategies might not be a good fit for you. So I really want to highlight all the potential positives and the potential negatives of each money saving strategy. Because sometimes we're told a money saving strategy, but it might not be comfortable for us. It's too far out of our comfort zone for us to realize the full potential. Because sometimes we have to battle through societal and cultural expectations of what we do with our money, and not all of it's fun or positive. Some of it can be quite negative to our own personal well-being. At the end of the day, extreme cheapskates and savers go through a lot of hardships to attain their financial freedom. So in this video, I'll go over some more tips on how I save money and the pros and cons of it. And if you're interested in the content, be sure to check out part 1 of my series. And before we start, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends, hit that notification bell if you like this content. And let's go. So here are some more ways to save money and be an extreme cheapskate. Number 1, free events and activities. So my wife and I are always on the lookout for free events. These are great places to go for dates and hang out with friends. This activity is usually a low pressure situation where you're not expected to spend a lot of money. I usually look for free events on Facebook, Nextdoor, or Eventbrite. Those are some of the best places to look for free events and sign up for them online. They have a bunch of local activities within your area, and you can also select the date of time you want to go. Usually there's a lot of weekend events, monthly events, and you have time to prepare and plan around that. For example, farmers market, cultural events, and community gatherings. Prior to the pandemic, there usually would be about 5 to 10 activities per weekend that were free to Seattleites. Now, of course, it's a lot harder as local events aren't as frequent, but there are some events that are still free and that are available during the pandemic. So you really have to look around a little bit on what kind of free activities are in your neck of the woods. So now let's talk about the pros of free events and activities. It's a low pressure environment where you can hang out with your friends and family and you don't have to pay the entrance fee. Usually, but not always, there's a lot of shops and vendors in the free event. They want to sell their goods and services to you. And that's part of the reason why it's free in the first place. You have a lot of local vendors that are willing to sell their goods at a community gathering place. Generally, these free events are more informational based than service based. So you have a lot of people trying to sell their goods and services, or the community is trying to tell you something and give you more information about some activity going on. When you go to a paid event like a band, a theme park, or a play, you're usually buying a specific good. Free events can be more educational about a certain local government service or about a paid promotional product. So it's more free-flowing and it's more random on what you're going to get during that event. Now let's talk about the cons of free events and activities. Generally, free events are more tame and they're a watered-down version of what you can get at a paid event, since the cost of a ticket can usually go towards something more flashy or fun. And if you're okay with that, then free events are a great way to spend your time. But aside from hanging out with friends and going on dates at free events, I found it generally less interesting than paid events. And usually these free events are a lot smaller than their paid larger cousins. So there might actually not be a lot of things to do there, and you might not spend a lot of time there. There were many times when I got hyped up about going to a cultural event or some farmer's market, and I got there and I realized it was very small and limited in space. The whole area could be covered in about 5 minutes, and it wasn't worth the drive or time to spend getting there. And lastly, the free events are usually only free if you want to walk around and just see the sights. If you want to eat the food, buy some stuff, or generally do some event, it's going to cost you money. Now, generally, these free events have cheaper prices overall in terms of produce and or food. But the downside is, eventually, if you want to do something besides just walk around, you'll have to spend money at that free event. Number 2, borrow from your network. Try to see if you can borrow things that you need from your friends or family. Now, this might seem obvious, but always try to ask your friends and family before you think about renting or buying something. I list this down because sometimes people are embarrassed about asking their friends and family for something that they can easily afford, and they're just not able to muster up the courage to ask other people. What I'm saying is, if you can handle the uncomfortable question, it's a great boon for you financially to borrow from others. If the name of the game is to save money, then it's in your best interest to try to see if you can get it for free rather than buying or renting it. So what are some of the pros about borrowing from your network? This might be silly, but it's a great way to get in touch with friends you haven't talked to in a long time. Even though you're asking for something from them, you might not have seen the friend for a very long time, and it's a great way to catch up with someone. And also, items tend to be in better shape because they actually have an owner that cares for it. Many times when I borrow stuff from my friends, they're in excellent condition and it's like brand new. And also, depending on the item and the frequency in which you use it, you can potentially save a lot of money down the line. Because a lot of things that you potentially can borrow might not have a lot of wear and tear associated with that. So now let's talk about the cons of borrowing from your network. So one of the big things is that if you borrow the same thing over and over from the same person, they might think that you're using them. Which, to be truthful, you kind of are. So make sure that you are giving them something in return. Maybe it's more time you spend in the relationship, maybe it's something that you give to them, something that contributes to the overall friendship so that they don't think that you're using them for the long term. Also, most of the time, nothing happens to the item and you can return it back to them without any issue. But sometimes the item might get damaged. And in the case the item gets damaged, there's an unwritten rule that you buy the item and replace it for them. I've never been in a position where I damaged an item and had to replace it for them, but be aware that that could possibly happen. And lastly, it might be better to actually buy the item in the long run. As much as I like to borrow certain items, there is a hassle factor that is involved in it. You have to keep going to that person, asking them, and then going to their house and picking that object up. At some point, it's not worth it for you to keep doing that, and you can just save more money by buying the item outright. So in the end, you have to take into consideration your own time when you're borrowing stuff and you're going back and forth from your friend's place. So number 3, negotiate frequently. I rarely buy new things nowadays, and when I do, I always try to negotiate to get the best price possible. But not usually in big box stores. I usually have limited success in those places. But usually like car sales, garage sales, farmers markets, I can usually get a better deal than what's advertised. And definitely where you can make a personal connection to the buyer, you have a better chance of negotiating a better deal. I try to make it a habit to push myself to negotiate even though it might be uncomfortable for myself or the seller. I have found out that larger dollar amounts are easier to get discounts than smaller dollar items. And so when in doubt, ask for a small discount and see where that takes you. If it works, maybe work your way up. If it doesn't work, then hold off on buying it or just buy retail. So what are some of the pros about negotiating frequently? The feeling of getting a discount is great. If you negotiate and you're successful, you get a great boost of confidence. And this allows you to gain further confidence when you negotiate with other people, and you'll be able to do it more often and more frequency. And also it helps you increase your social ability to be in uncomfortable situations with people. This helps you by negotiating slightly adversarial conversations that you might not otherwise be in. And if you're able to navigate that successfully, you'll be able to better handle confrontations in the long run. So what are some of the cons about negotiating all the time? Well, first, people might think you're adversarial and they might not think that you're very friendly. You really have to gauge the person that you're asking a discount from. Sometimes you're just dealing with someone that just won't give you a discount, and other times you want to be very careful when asking for a discount. They might be on the fence on whether or not to give you one in the first place. Asking for a discount when you're normally shy or non-confrontational, it can be very tough. The act of negotiation is like a mini confrontation. You have to kind of push and pull until one or the other gives way. It is definitely not for everyone, but there are little steps you can take to try to negotiate in low pressure situations and then eventually get to negotiating comfortably. And lastly, I just want to mention, it doesn't always work. Many times the success rate is very low. Out of 10 times that I try to negotiate, maybe 1 or 2 of those times would actually work for me. But in this case, I'm focusing on the greater probabilities. But for most cases, the more times I try to negotiate, the higher the chances that I'll actually be successful at it. So even though my success rate might be 20%, if I do it 100 times, that's still 20 times. If I do it 10 times, that's 2 times. So by and large, don't expect it to work all the time. You have to have some considerations that it won't work most of the time. Number 4, don't follow the culture. America is generally focused on consumerism and buying stuff. Almost every holiday is focused on spending of some kind. Black Friday, Cyber Mondays, Christmas, you name it, we have a holiday that requires you to spend money. It is very hard to not to follow the culture and expectations that we have of each other. So my advice when you're starting a new trend and it might require you to spend money, think about whether or not you actually want to spend that money over the long term, because it might cost you more than you realize. Ask if it's a need or want to follow that trend. Really consider the financial impacts and try to minimize that as best as you can. In the end, most of what we want in the short term isn't something that we'll remember or want in the long term. So what are some of the pros about not following cultural expectations? You have a much better idea on what matters to you. You're not influenced by outside circumstances. By not focusing on consumerism culture, it's a lot easier to focus on what matters to you the most. Family, friends, and long-term goals can now be your focus. And also, there's less stress and anxiety to keep up with the Joneses. Most of what we do in this culture is to try to maintain or exceed someone's status. We're always in a rat race to try to compete with others to see who has the bigger stick. I am not immune to this as well. There are times when I'm jealous of someone else's status and I want that status as well. But I do try to remind myself of the longer term goals that I have and then refocus on those. And lastly, being aware of how our consumerist culture can help free you. Once you realize how our culture can push us into spending more, you have the ability to change that. You can then focus on creating a life that's more sustainable and equitable for you. So what are some of the cons about don't follow our culture? You're always going to be tempted by money and status of others. There's just no way to get around that. Because our culture keeps flashing images of wealth, success, and fame, it's hard for us to disengage from that and focus in on ourselves. Going against the grain might be isolating. Not many people will get that you don't want to be part of the consumerist culture. And you might actually lose some friends over it because they don't understand your spending habits or why you want to be an extreme cheapskate. And then also missing out on the collective joy of the culture. Sometimes spending gifts and money with others can be a very fulfilling activity, and that's not all bad. Unfortunately, a lot of the activities in our culture requires money. And sometimes when you're not spending that money, you can be missing out on that collective joy of the culture. So number 5, share while dining out. My wife and I split dinners while we're going out to eat. We usually have one appetizer and one large meal to share between the both of us. Portion sizes are usually large enough that both my wife and I can feel full after eating that meal. And we both end up spending less because usually a meal for 2 is around the $50 range with dinner and drinks. But because we're sharing the entree, we can get the cost usually under $30. The large portion sizes that we usually get with 2 entrees are usually too much for us to eat. So in general, we save much more money by sharing an entree and maybe getting an appetizer or 2. And if we're still hungry, we might get a snack or 2 once we get home. So what are some of the pros about sharing your meals together? So basically, it saves you a ton of money if you go out and eat with your spouse all the time. It's basically taking 50% off of your meal every meal. You also eat less overall and you don't feel full or bloated afterwards. So if you're trying to lose weight or cut out some calories, then maybe sharing a meal might be just the thing for you. And if I don't feel like I'm satiated during the meal, about 30 minutes to an hour later, I don't even feel it anymore. You usually get full on less food than you actually think you do. So what are some of the cons about sharing while eating out? You must go out with someone that will be willing to share food with you. This is by far the hardest method for you to overcome if the person you're with doesn't want to share food. Most people want to get their own entree regardless of the cost savings. They just want to eat what they want and they don't want to share it. And also, you have to pick a plate that both of you are willing to eat. So if you or your partner have any dietary restrictions, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to come to a consensus on what you guys want to share. And lastly, it's also very difficult for you to get used to in the first place. When I started out, I wanted to eat my own plate and I didn't really want to share. My wife was really the one who pushed me to share food. And it really took me a year or 2 before I got comfortable to the idea. So be aware when you're going down this extreme cheapskate method that it might take some time to get used to and you might have a resistance towards it in the beginning. So those were 5 more extreme cheapskate ways that I've used to save money over the last couple of years. In this video, I focus more on money saving ideas rather than specific things that I've saved money on. I really wanted to talk about the more broader aspects of these positive and negative money saving ideas, which I don't think most people appreciate because they only look at the positive aspects of saving money and not the negative downsides to it. Even though these ideas are generally simple to implement, it's very hard to put in practice because we're constantly conditioned by a culture that really wants us to spend money, and we also have friends that generally think the same way as well. The power of social influences are real and very powerful. The extreme savers and cheapskates of the world usually has a way of combating those negative feelings that our culture puts on us. And if you can really push through the consumerist culture and figure out what matters to you the most, and then you can be part of the extreme cheapskate and saver ways without feeling isolated from the rest of society. You don't have to implement all these money saving strategies, just the ones that you think you'll be able to sustain over a long period of time. So thank you for watching. Be sure to leave me a comment down below on what kind of things that make you an extreme cheapskate and what are some of the pros and cons of that are. And I'll see you next time.